Mutiny on the Potemkin. On June 14th, 1905, the Russian battleship Knyaz, Potemkin Tavrichesky, was at sea in the Black Sea conducting artillery maneuvers with the rest of the Imperial Russian fleet when its sailors refused to eat their meat ration. The ship's doctor had declared the meat riddled with maggots visible to the naked eye, fit for consumption. The sailors did not agree. What followed began as a protest over food and became one of the defining events of the Russian Revolution of 1905. Senior officers responded to the sailors' refusal by attempting to identify and punish the ringleaders. First Officer Gilyarovsky drew his pistol and shot dead Grigory Vaklenchuk, one of the protest's most vocal participants on the deck. The killing triggered the full mutiny. Sailors seized the ship, killing or throwing overboard the captain and several other senior officers. Gilyarovsky was shot and his body thrown into the sea. The Potemkin then sailed to Odessa, which was already in the grip of a general strike and street fighting between protesters and Tsarist forces. The arrival of a mutinous warship in the harbor transformed the local uprising. Tens of thousands of Odessans gathered at the port to support the sailors. The body of the slain Vaklenchuk was displayed in the harbor as a martyr. When Tsarist troops opened fire on the crowd on the Odessa steps, killing and wounding hundreds, the sailors responded by firing shells at a theater building believed to house military headquarters, though the shot missed its target. The Potemkin then sailed the Black Sea for 11 days, approaching other fleet vessels, whose crews had been expected to follow the mutiny, but largely declined before sailing to Romania and surrendering the ship to Romanian authorities at the port of Constanta. Most of the mutinous crew chose exile in Romania rather than return to Russia and face execution. Vaklenchuk, the officer whose killing had sparked the revolt, became a revolutionary symbol. The Potemkin's mutiny was immortalized 20 years later in Sergei Eisenstein's 1925 silent film, which used the event as both a historical document and a political manifesto. The last surviving crew member, Ivan Beshov, died in Dublin in 1987 at the age of 102, having spent the remainder of his life running a fish and chip shop after finding his way to Ireland via decades of exile. USS Maine, Havana Harbor. On February 15, 1898. The American battleship USS Maine was moored in Havana Harbor, Cuba, having been sent there by the McKinley administration in January, ostensibly to protect American citizens and business interests during an ongoing Cuban uprising against Spanish colonial rule. At 9:40 in the evening, a catastrophic explosion tore through the ship's forward section, and the Maine sank rapidly, killing 266 of the 374 men aboard. The cause of the explosion was never definitively established, a fact that has haunted the event ever since. In 1898, a U.S. Naval Court of Inquiry concluded that an external explosion had detonated a forward ammunition magazine, a finding consistent with sabotage or a mine. Spain conducted its own investigation and concluded the explosion had been internal. The phrase, "Remember the Maine to hell with Spain," coined almost immediately by the American Yellow Press, particularly newspapers owned by William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, who had been aggressively covering Cuban tensions as a circulation strategy, became one of the most effective propaganda slogans in American history. The Maine's sinking, framed as a Spanish attack on a sovereign American vessel, provided the public justification for the United States Congress to declare war on Spain in April 1898, beginning the Spanish-American War. In 1976, a U.S. Navy technical investigation led by Admiral Hyman Rickover re-examined all available evidence and concluded the most likely cause was internal spontaneous combustion in a coal bunker adjacent to the ammunition magazine, caused by the heating of coal stored too close to the magazine's thin walls, a known hazard of coal-burning vessels at the time that the ship's crew had reportedly flagged in the weeks before the explosion. No definitive evidence of Spanish sabotage or a mine has ever been established. The sinking of a ship whose cause remains genuinely uncertain, interpreted immediately and loudly as enemy action dragged two nations into a war that reshaped the Caribbean, delivered the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico to American control, and killed thousands more on both sides. The wreck of the Maine was raised from Havana Harbor in 1912, examined one final time by engineers who again found evidence consistent with both internal and external explosion theories, and sunk at sea with military honors. It rests on the floor of the Atlantic. The question of what actually destroyed the Maine has never been closed with certainty. What is certain is that 286 men died in a harbor explosion, whose cause was immediately and definitively assigned by the American press before any serious investigation had been completed, and that the political use of their deaths started a war. HMS Hood, Denmark Strait. On May 24, 1941, the British battlecruiser HMS Hood, the most famous warship in the Royal Navy, and once the largest in the world, was steaming at speed through the Denmark Strait between Iceland and Greenland, paired with the battleship HMS Prince of Wales, in an urgent attempt to intercept the German battleship Bismarck and heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, which had broken into the Atlantic and threatened to destroy Allied shipping convoys. The Hood had been commissioned in 1920 and served as the embodiment of British naval power for 2 decades, visiting ports around the world as a diplomatic instrument and a show of force. She was beloved in a way very few warships are. What Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland knew, and what kept the engagement pressing, was that the Hood's design had an Achilles heel. Her horizontal armor plating was far thinner than her vertical belt armor, making her more vulnerable to plunging fire from long ranges, where shells fell at a steep angle onto the deck rather than striking the side. At the distances involved in the Denmark Strait engagement, this was not a theoretical concern. At 5:52 in the morning, with both sides firing a salvo from Bismarck struck somewhere in Hood's aftersection. A huge column of flame shot skyward. There was a brief pause, and then the aft magazines detonated in a cataclysmic explosion that split the ship in two. The bow section remained briefly above water, pointing almost vertically upward before sliding under. The entire sequence from the fatal hit to disappearance took approximately 3 minutes. Of Hood's 418 officers and men, only 3 survived, plucked from the freezing water by a destroyer. It was the single greatest loss of life from one warship in Royal Navy history. The shock in Britain was profound and immediate. The destruction of Hood triggered one of the most intensive naval hunts in the war's history. The Royal Navy deployed virtually its entire Atlantic fleet to find and sink Bismarck, which was accomplished 3 days later. In the final accounting, the Denmark Strait engagement cost Britain her most famous ship and bond down 415 men. The subsequent sinking of Bismarck cost Germany the same ship and approximately 2,086 of its 2,200 crew. More than 3,500 men died in 9 days over one naval encounter. USS Arizona, Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, the American battleship USS Arizona was moored at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, alongside the other vessels of the Pacific Fleet's Battleship Row, when Japanese aircraft began their attack at 7:55 in the morning. Many of the crew were still at breakfast. Some officers had gone ashore the previous evening to spend time with family. The Arizona had been in Pearl Harbor long enough that some men had girlfriends and families in Honolulu. It was Sunday morning. At 8:06 a.m., a Japanese Type 99 dive bomber released an 800-kilogram armor-piercing bomb modified from a 16-inch naval shell, which penetrated the Arizona's upper deck and detonated adjacent to or inside the forward powder magazine. What happened next lasted approximately 9 seconds and was visible from miles away. The forward section of the Arizona was lifted bodily out of the water by the force of the magazine explosion before slamming back down. The fireball rose hundreds of feet into the air. The entire forward quarter of the ship was destroyed almost instantaneously. An estimated 900 men died in those 9 seconds alone. Of the Arizona's Stream 512 crew aboard at the time of the attack, now 177 were killed. Nearly 80% of those on board, almost half of all American deaths at Pearl Harbor that morning. The ship burned for 2 days. Survivors described the water around the ship as covered in burning oil, making even escape into the harbor a potentially fatal choice. The chaplain, Thomas Kirkpatrick, was among the dead. The ship's band, which had competed in a battle of music contest the previous evening and returned to the ship late, was largely lost. The Arizona settled onto the harbor bottom in approximately 9 minutes. More than 900 of the 177 dead were never recovered and remain aboard the wreck to this day, which is now designated an official cemetery and war memorial. the USS Arizona Memorial. A white concrete structure spanning the ship's hull without touching it was dedicated in 1962. The ship still slowly leaks oil into the harbor, a phenomenon visitors can observe, sometimes called the Tears of the Arizona by guides. The attack on Pearl Harbor brought the United States into the Second World War. The Arizona is the reason it was called a day that would live in infamy. The ship still contains an estimated 500,000 gallons of fuel oil in its tanks, which seep slowly through the deteriorating hull at a rate estimated at about 1 quart per day. Engineers have modeled the hull's deterioration and estimated the ship may eventually rupture more significantly within the coming decades, releasing the remaining fuel in a way that would impact the harbor's ecosystem and the memorial above it. No decision has been made about how or whether to address this. The wreck's status as a designated military grave means any large-scale intervention would require removing or disturbing the remains of the men inside it. Battleship Yamato Operation Tengo. On April 6, 1945, the Japanese battleship Yamato, the largest and most heavily armed battleship ever constructed by any nation, departed Tokuyama Harbor with a task force consisting of the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers. She had fuel enough for a one-way voyage. Her crew of 332 men knew this. The mission, designated Operation Tengo, required the Yamato to push through American naval forces, defending the invasion of Okinawa, where Allied troops had landed 5 days earlier, then beach herself on the coast and fight as a fixed coastal artillery battery until she was destroyed while her crew joined the island's defenders on land. It was a mission designed for honorable destruction rather than victory. The American military had already broken Japanese naval codes and was fully aware the Yamato was coming. 2 American submarines shadowed the task force from the moment it left harbor, radioing its course speed. And position to Task Force 58, the massive American carrier strike group positioned east of Okinawa. On the morning of April 7th, 386, aircraft from 11 American aircraft carriers launched in successive waves. The first wave found the Yamato at 12:37 in the afternoon. The battle lasted less than 2 hours, the American pilots having learned from the sinking of the Yamato's sister ship, Musashi, the previous October, that spreading torpedo hits across both sides of such a large vessel allowed it to flood symmetrically and remain upright, deliberately concentrated all torpedo attacks on the Yamato's port side to accelerate a list and prevent the crew from counter-flooding. By 2:23 in the afternoon, after absorbing an estimated 11 torpedo hits and 6 bomb strikes, the Yamato's list had become uncontrollable. Her magazines detonated in an explosion so large it produced a mushroom cloud visible for miles, the shockwave knocking American pilots out of their seats, and the concussion felt by ships many kilometers away. Of her crew of 3,332, only 277 survived. 3 of 5 men died with her. The Japanese also lost the Yahagi and 4 of the 8 destroyers. Total Japanese deaths in the engagement exceeded 4,000. The Americans lost 10 aircraft and 12 airmen. The Yamato was the last operational sortie of the Imperial Japanese Navy as a fighting force. No Japanese battleship ever put to sea again in the war's remaining 4 months. HMS Barham Mediterranean. On November 25, 1941, the British battleship HMS Barham was steaming in formation, with 2 other battleships of the Mediterranean Fleet, HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Valiant, operating south of Greece, when the German submarine U-331 penetrated the destroyer screen undetected and fired a salvo of 4 torpedoes at close range. 3 struck the Barham in rapid succession on her port side, tearing open her hull below the waterline. Ship immediately began to list sharply to port. At 4:29 in the afternoon, just 4 minutes after being struck, the Barham rolled onto her side and her magazines detonated. A massive explosion consumed the ship. Debris rained down on the surrounding vessels for minutes afterward. Of the Barham's complement of 184 men, 862 were killed. The explosion was filmed by a British newsreel cameraman who happened to be aboard one of the accompanying battleships, producing some of the most extraordinary and horrifying footage of a warship's destruction ever captured on camera. The British Admiralty suppressed the footage and the news of the sinking for more than a month, fearing the effect on public morale, informing the families of the dead only that their relatives were missing. Some men's families received no official notification of the ship's loss for nearly 6 weeks. The Royal Navy gave permission for the newsreel footage to be released in 1942, and it has since been broadcast many times. HMS Barham holds the distinction of being the only British battleship sunk by a submarine in the Second World War, and remains technically the last British battleship ever sunk in combat. What made the loss particularly cruel was that U-331's commander, Oberleutnant Hans Dietrich von Teisenhausen, had penetrated the destroyer escort not through special intelligence or extraordinary skill, but because one of the protective destroyers had turned at a critical moment during a routine zigzag maneuver, accidentally opening a corridor through which the submarine passed undetected. The gap lasted only minutes, but it was enough. The Barham had been present at some of the most significant naval actions of the First World War, had served for more than 25 years, and was sunk by 3 torpedoes in 4 minutes in the middle of an open ocean transit. Her wreck lies in approximately 900 meters of water in the Mediterranean. She's still largely intact, designated a war grave under international maritime law. The German Naval High Command did not learn until after the war that their own submarine had been responsible for the sinking, because the British suppression of the news had been so effective that German intelligence had no reliable confirmation of the Barham's loss for weeks. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for similar ones, and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments below.